HOA Karen slaps me in the face because I didn't talk when walking with my friend. This is how it started. It was escalating. That's the only way to describe it. The HOA Karen encounters, the Mildred McMillan incidents, whatever you wanted to call them, they were no longer just bizarre. They were actively unnerving. This is how it started. The afternoon was deceptively pleasant. A gentle breeze rustled the perfectly manicured leaves of Willowbrook Estates. The sun cast long, aesthetically pleasing shadows across the impeccably green lawns, and the air was, for once, blessedly free of the drone of lawnmowers and the distant whine of HOA Karen's white SUV. My friend Sarah was visiting from out of town, and we were enjoying a rare moment of suburban tranquility. A quiet walk through the neighborhood, catching up, simply enjoying the peace. "It's very beige," Sarah had observed, her voice a low murmur, taking in the uniform color palette of Willowbrook Estates with a mixture of amusement and mild horror. "Beige is the official color of harmony," I'd replied, echoing HOA Karen's favorite mantra with a touch of irony. Apparently, vibrant colors disrupt the aesthetic flow. We'd chuckled, falling into a comfortable silence, enjoying the quiet companionship, the gentle rhythm of our footsteps on the sidewalk, the simple pleasure of a peaceful walk. We didn't need to fill the silence with chatter. We were content in our shared quietude. And then she materialized. HOA Karen Mildred McMillan, appearing as if summoned by the mere mention of aesthetic flow, stepped directly into our path, blocking the sidewalk with her perfectly beige presence. Her perfectly symmetrical sunglasses were firmly in place, her expression a carefully constructed mask of suburban disapproval. "Excuse me," she declared, her voice cutting through the afternoon quiet like a perfectly sharpened hedge trimmer. "You." Her gaze, hidden behind the mirrored lenses, was fixed on us. Silence. "Yes, Karen?" I'd asked, sighing inwardly, bracing myself for the latest installment of HOA Karen's suburban pronouncements. Sarah, bless her city-dweller heart, just looked bewildered. HOA Karen gestured vaguely between us, her perfectly manicured hand fluttering dismissively. "You're walking together." "Yes," I'd confirmed, stating the obvious. "We are. And you're not talking." It wasn't a question, but an accusation, delivered with the full weight of HOA Karen's suburban authority. I'd blinked, struggling to comprehend the nature of this latest complaint. "No, we're enjoying the quiet. Is there a rule against quiet walks now, Karen?" HOA Karen scoffed, a dismissive sound that could curdle beige paint. "Rules, Mr. Jenkins, are not always written. Some things are simply understood. In Willowbrook Estates, we value community engagement, neighborly interaction. And," she leaned in inconspiratorially, lowering her voice to a stage whisper, "talking when you're outside is part of that." Sarah, finally finding her voice, interjected, her tone a mixture of polite confusion and barely suppressed amusement. "I'm sorry, are you saying we're required to talk when we walk outside? Is that an HOA rule?" HOA Karen turned her perfectly symmetrical gaze on Sarah, assessing her, categorizing her, undoubtedly finding her wanting in some beige-approved metric. "It's not a rule, per se," she conceded, as if reluctantly admitting a minor technicality, "but it's community expectation. When you walk outside, you should engage. You should contribute to the atmosphere. Silence," she declared with a dramatic flourish, "is unneighborly. It makes the town feel unwelcoming. Less nice." "Less nice?" I repeated, my incredulity reaching its peak. "Karen, we're just walking, quietly, enjoying the afternoon. How is that making the town less nice?" HOA Karen's perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowed, a clear sign that logic and reason were about to be spectacularly disregarded. "It's about atmosphere, Mr. Jenkins. Suburban ambiance. A town where people walk in silence is a town that is unhappy, uncommunicative, unsociable." "Or," Sarah interjected, her voice now edged with a hint of steel, "maybe it's just a town where people are respecting each other's peace and quiet. Maybe some people like to walk in silence." HOA Karen waved a dismissive hand again, as if swatting away Sarah's city-dweller logic like an annoying fly. "Irrelevant," she declared. "In Willowbrook Estates, we talk when we walk. It's nicer that way. It creates a more vibrant community atmosphere." And then she did it. Without warning, without preamble, without even a flicker of hesitation, HOA Karen Mildred McMillan, queen of suburban pronouncements and self-appointed guardian of Willowbrook Estates niceness, slapped me. Her hand, perfectly manicured, perfectly beige-toned, connected with my cheek, with a sharp, stinging crack. The sound echoed in the otherwise quiet suburban afternoon, a shocking, violent punctuation mark to her absurd demand for mandatory neighborly chatter. Sarah gasped, stepping back, her eyes wide with disbelief and horror. I stood frozen, stunned, my cheek burning, my mind reeling from the sheer, unadulterated physicality of HOA Karen's suburban enforcement. HOA Karen, her hand still slightly raised, her perfectly symmetrical sunglasses still firmly in place, simply nodded, as if the slap was a perfectly reasonable, perfectly logical consequence of my silent walk. "There," she declared, her voice regaining its usual icy composure. "Now that was unneighborly, Mr. Jenkins. That was disruptive. That is not how we behave in Willowbrook Estates." And then she turned, beige pantsuit perfectly creased, and walked away, leaving Sarah and me standing on the sidewalk, stunned, silent, and utterly, completely slapped. This is how it escalated. This is how HOA Karen crossed the line. And this is how Willowbrook Estates finally was about to witness the glorious, community-driven, and utterly satisfying fallout of HOA Karen's slap heard round the suburb. The immediate aftermath of the slap was surreal. Sarah, understandably, was furious, her city-bred sense of personal space and basic human decency utterly violated by HOA Karen's suburban assault. I was still reeling, my cheeks stinging, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity, the physical violence of it all. She slapped you?" Sarah repeated, her voice rising in disbelief as we retreated to my porch, seeking refuge from the beige-clad menace of Willowbrook Estates. "She actually hit you? For not talking?" "I know," I said, rubbing my cheek, still feeling the sting. "It's insane, right? Like cartoonishly evil HOA lady insane." "Cartoonishly evil is putting it mildly," Sarah exclaimed. "This isn't just about rules anymore. This is assault. You should call the police." The idea of calling the police on HOA Karen for slapping me for not talking while walking felt almost too absurd, too surreal, even for Willowbrook Estates. But Sarah was right. This wasn't just about annoying rules or passive-aggressive pronouncements anymore. This was physical violence. This was wrong. Word of the sidewalk slap incident, as young Mr. Davis immediately dubbed it, spread through Willowbrook Estates with the speed of suburban gossip wildfire. The absurdity of it, the sheer Karen-ness of it, the shocking physical escalation. It was the talk of every porch, every text thread, every hushed conversation behind perfectly manicured hedges. The outrage was palpable. Even the most mild-mannered residents of Willowbrook Estates were appalled. HOA Karen had finally, definitively crossed a line. She had moved beyond annoying rules and passive-aggressive enforcement into physical assault. And that, it seemed, was a bridge too far, even for the beige-tolerant residents of Willowbrook Estates. The porch summit convened with a sense of urgency and righteous anger. Young Mr. Davis, his usual playful demeanor replaced by grim determination, declared, "This isn't just ridiculous anymore. This is criminal. She can't just go around slapping people because they're not chatty enough for her liking." Mrs. Rodriguez, usually the voice of calm reason, was visibly incensed. "She needs to apologize," she stated firmly. "A public apology. To you, to Sarah, and to the entire neighborhood. This kind of behavior is unacceptable." Old Mr. Henderson, surprisingly, was the most vocal. "Apology isn't enough," he declared, his voice surprisingly strong. "She needs to face consequences. This isn't just a rule violation. This is assault. We need to do something." And that's how the idea of the Willowbrook Estates Community Dialogue and Accountability Initiative was born. Not just a protest, not just a demand for an apology, but a collective, community-wide effort to address HOA Karen's escalating behavior, to demand accountability for her actions, and to establish a clear, unequivocal message. Physical assault is not acceptable in Willowbrook Estates. Not for anyone. Not even HOA Karen Mildred McMillan. The plan took shape quickly, fueled by shared outrage and a growing sense of community solidarity. We would draft a community letter, signed by as many Willowbrook Estates residents as possible, demanding a public apology from HOA Karen for the slap, and calling for a community-wide dialogue about respecting personal boundaries and preventing future incidents of HOA Karen-esque enforcement. We would deliver the letter to HOA Karen publicly, and we would demand a response. And if she refused to apologize, if she refused to take responsibility for her actions, well, then Willowbrook Estates, finally united, would be ready to escalate. The slap may have been HOA Karen's attempt to enforce suburban niceness, but it was about to backfire spectacularly, unleashing a wave of community action and accountability that would redefine Willowbrook Estates, and hopefully, finally, rein in the reign of HOA Karen Mildred McMillan. The Willowbrook Estates Community Dialogue and Accountability Initiative letter spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Young Mr. Davis, leveraging his social media skills, created an online version for easy digital signatures, while Mrs. Rodriguez and old Mr. Henderson went door to door, collecting signatures on physical copies, their quiet determination proving surprisingly persuasive. The letter was carefully worded, firm but measured, outlining the sidewalk slap incident, expressing community concern about the escalation of HOA Karen's enforcement tactics, demanding a public apology for the assault, and calling for a community forum to discuss respectful neighborly interactions and the importance of personal boundaries within Willowbrook Estates. Within hours, signatures poured in. Neighbors, initially hesitant to publicly challenge HOA Karen, were galvanized by the sheer audacity of the slap. The letter became a symbol of collective defiance, a tangible expression of community outrage. Even Brenda McMillan, the HOA president, signed, albeit with a slightly strained expression, a clear indication that even the HOA leadership was starting to recognize that HOA Karen had gone too far. With the letter signed by an overwhelming majority of Willowbrook Estates residents, we prepared for the public delivery. Young Mr. Davis, never one to miss a dramatic opportunity, suggested a community delegation delivery, a peaceful but visually impactful group procession to HOA Karen's house to present the letter and demand a response. On the designated evening, a crowd gathered at the community green space, a diverse group of Willowbrook Estates residents, armed with signed letters and a shared sense of purpose. We walked together, a silent but determined procession, towards HOA Karen's perfectly beige residence, the setting sun casting long shadows across our faces, our collective footsteps echoing in the quiet suburban evening. We arrived at HOA Karen's house, a substantial crowd now gathered on her perfectly manicured lawn, a silent, watchful presence surrounding her beige fortress of suburban solitude. Young Mr. Davis, as designated spokesperson, stepped forward, letter in hand, and knocked firmly on HOA Karen's door. Silence. The door remained closed. Curtains twitched behind the perfectly symmetrical windows, but HOA Karen did not appear. Young Mr. Davis knocked again, louder this time, his voice ringing out across the silent lawn. "Miss McMillan, we are here to deliver a community letter. We request a response." Still silence. Still no sign of HOA Karen. Undeterred, young Mr. Davis raised his voice, addressing not just the closed door, but the entire neighborhood, the silent, watchful houses of Willowbrook Estates. Residents of Willowbrook Estates, we are here today because one of our neighbors, Mildred McMillan, has crossed a line. She has resorted to physical violence to enforce her own peculiar vision of suburban niceness. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. We are here to say, unequivocally, that physical assault is not acceptable in Willowbrook Estates. We are here to demand accountability. We are here to demand a public apology. And we are here to initiate a community dialogue about respect, boundaries, and what it truly means to be a neighbor in Willowbrook Estates. He paused, holding up the stack of signed letters. We have delivered this letter, signed by a vast majority of Willowbrook Estates residents, to Miss McMillan's door. We expect a response, we expect an apology, and we expect a commitment to change. He lowered the letter, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd, his voice filled with quiet but unwavering resolve. We will wait, we will be silent, but we will not be ignored. Willowbrook Estates deserves better than HOA Karen's enforcement by slap. We deserve respect, we deserve accountability, and we deserve a community where everyone feels safe, respected, and unslapped. And with that, Willowbrook Estates fell silent. The crowd stood on HOA Karen's lawn, a silent, watchful vigil, waiting for a response, waiting for accountability, waiting for HOA Karen Mildred McMillan to finally publicly address the slap heard round the suburb. The stage was set, the community had spoken, and Willowbrook Estates held its breath, waiting to see if HOA Karen would finally, epically and perhaps reluctantly, apologize. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, across HOA Karen's lawn. The Willowbrook Estates community delegation stood firm, a silent, watchful presence, their collective gaze fixed on the closed door of HOA Karen's house, waiting for a sign, waiting for a response, waiting for accountability. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours in the tense suburban stillness. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the lawn, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets, sounds that only amplified the weight of the unspoken demand hanging in the air. Then, finally, a sound. A faint click, the sound of a lock turning. The front door of HOA Karen's house slowly creaked open. HOA Karen Mildred McMillan stood in the doorway, framed by the beige-toned interior of her home, her silhouette stark against the fading sunlight. She was still perfectly dressed, still perfectly coiffed, still wearing her perfectly symmetrical sunglasses, but something was different. The usual icy confidence was gone, replaced by a visible tremor, a subtle but undeniable vulnerability. She stepped onto the porch, hesitantly, clutching a piece of paper in her trembling hand. She surveyed the crowd, her gaze sweeping across the silent, watchful faces, her perfectly sculpted jaw visibly tightening. This was not the compliant, age-loving Willowbrook Estates she thought she controlled. This was a community united, demanding accountability, and watching her. She cleared her throat, the sound scratchy and uncharacteristically uncertain. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she began to read from the paper in her hand. To the residents of Willowbrook Estates, she began, her voice wavering slightly. I want to address the incident that occurred yesterday. She paused, her gaze dropping to the paper, her voice barely audible. My actions were inappropriate and unacceptable. Another pause, longer this time. She seemed to be struggling, the words catching in her throat, the carefully constructed facade of HOA Karen crumbling further with each hesitant syllable. I understand that my attempt to encourage neighborly interaction went too far. She winced, as if the words themselves were physically painful to utter. And I apologize. The word hung in the air, fragile, hesitant, but undeniably there. Apology. From HOA Karen Mildred McMillan, publicly, to the entire community. It was almost unbelievable. She continued, her voice gaining a fraction of strength, though still laced with a tremor of something. Humiliation? Regret? Perhaps even a sliver of genuine remorse? It was hard to tell, hidden behind the sunglasses, masked by the carefully constructed HOA Karen persona. I understand that my behavior caused distress and fear, and that is not my intention. My intention, she insisted, her voice momentarily regaining a hint of its old authority, was always to maintain harmony, to foster a nice community. But even she seemed to hear the hollowness in those words, the irony of invoking niceness after slapping a neighbor for not talking. Her voice faltered again, the paper in her hand trembling more visibly. I am willing to participate in a community dialogue, she mumbled, almost as an afterthought, to discuss respectful neighborly interactions and personal boundaries. She trailed off, her gaze dropping to the ground, the paper falling limp in her hand. The apology, such as it was over. HOA Karen Mildred McMillan, publicly humbled, publicly apologetic, publicly defeated. A collective sigh rippled through the crowd. It wasn't a perfect apology, not heartfelt, not exactly brimming with genuine remorse, but it was an apology, a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And in Willowbrook Estates, in the face of HOA Karen's seemingly unyielding authority, it was enough. For now. Young Mr. Davis stepped forward, breaking the silence, his voice calm and measured. Thank you, Miss McMillan, he said, his tone neutral, neither forgiving nor accusatory. We appreciate your statement, and we look forward to participating in a constructive community dialogue to ensure that Willowbrook Estates is a community where everyone feels safe, respected, and unslapped. The crowd slowly, quietly began to disperse, the tension in the air gradually dissipating, replaced by a sense of resolution. Not complete closure, not yet, but a step forward, a step towards accountability. A step towards a Willowbrook Estates where even HOA Karen Mildred McMillan could be held responsible for her actions. A step towards a community where physical assault was not tolerated, where personal boundaries were respected, and where the sound of silence on a quiet afternoon walk was not just acceptable, but peaceful. And that, we hoped, was an epic beginning to a new, less slapped, and hopefully much nicer Willowbrook Estates.